Good afternoon and welcome to the 747th meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO of the club. Recognized as the premier nonpartisan forum in the nation, the Economic Club stands as the leading platform for discussions on social, economic, and political issues. For more than a century, the club has hosted over 1,000 prominent guests, and we have a tradition of excellence that continues up to today. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to students who are joining us virtually from the CUNY Graduate Center, Rutgers University, Columbia University, and Mercy University. A special welcome to the class of 2024 fellows, our largest and most diverse group to date, some of whom are joining us today. I'm honored to welcome back our special guest, Charlie Cook, founder of the Cook Political Report and political analyst for the National Journal Group. Charlie founded the independent, nonpartisan Cook Political Report in 1984, serving as its editor and publisher for 37 years, stepping down in 2021. Covering and analyzing U.S. elections and domestic policy trends, the New York Times once said it was a newsletter that both parties regard as authoritative, while CBS News' Bob Schieffer called it the Bible of the political community. Al Hunt in the Wall Street Journal has referred to Cook as the Picasso of election analysis. In 2010, Charlie was the co-recipient of the American Political Science Association's prestigious Carey McWilliams Award to honor a major journalistic contribution to our understanding of politics. In 2013, Charlie served as a resident fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. The format today will be a conversation, and we're honored to have club member Ken Bentsen as our moderator. Ken is the president and CEO of SIFMA. We're going to end promptly at 12:45, and as a reminder, this conversation is on the record, and we do have a number of media outlets on the line. In addition, we will be using the chat box for this conversation. You can enter questions directly in the chat box for their consideration if time permits. I know we had a few questions come in from members earlier, and I've already passed those on. Without further ado, I'm honored to pass this time over to you, Ken. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you everyone for joining. I understand the club had Tom Brady last week in Florida. Tom Brady is the Charlie Cook of professional football, and so we're honored to have Charlie here. He is truly a greatest of all time political prognosticator and a close personal and longtime friend. So good to be with you, Charlie.
Good to see you, Ken. And your nose is getting longer and longer.
Right, exactly.
Telling such an untruth.
Right.
But it's appreciated anyway.
Yeah. So let's sort of dig into it. Charlie and I talked last week, and I think maybe we'll talk obviously sort of the big elephant in the room is the presidential election, and then so we'll spend a lot of time on that, and then morph into what's going on in congressional, obviously not unrelated. So just starting with Charlie, we're 8 months away from the general election. Maybe it's a little closer to 6 when you think about when early voting begins in certain states. Where do things stand right now?
Obviously goes, the normal disclaimer that things can change, but I would be, for a variety of reasons, I would be very, very surprised if President Biden were to get 270 electoral votes. That whether you look at it from a top-down sort of macro perspective or a micro, state by state, he's got his work really, really cut out for him. And that a lot of people just sort of make an assumption that any election that Donald Trump's name is on the ballot will be primarily about him. But, presidential elections involving incumbents are generally the referenda on the incumbent. And what's so unique about this election, is there'll be the first one since 1892 where you had a rematch, a matchup between two back-to-back presidents. And I think what that does, Ken, is it basically invites a side-by-side comparison for that little swing. You've got 45% that are going to vote Republican no matter what, and 45% that are going to vote Democratic no matter what, and only like 8 or 10 in the middle. But for that 8 or 10, it invites a comparison. Was I better off before January 20th, 2021, or have I been better off since? And when you look at the polling data, that's not a frame that is helpful in any way to President Biden. And whether it should, whether they should view it that way or not is something else. But those comparisons don't look good on, a wide variety of the top issues that people say will matter in their voting.
So I want to dig down a little bit on that, maybe both in terms of why Biden is struggling from a policy perspective and political and policy perspective, and then also maybe quantitatively talk about where the Electoral College votes are and how any shift that's occurred since over the 4 years because we went through reapportionment. But maybe if you sort of as you said, it's a referendum on the incumbent, and maybe more about the incumbent than the previous incumbent. You're looking, you and I talked about this the other day. You've got competing surveys out there, economic surveys. If you think about the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey, and then you have the Conference Board survey, and they're kind of going in opposite directions. And yet, and particularly the Conference Board, fairly positive if you're an incumbent. Some of the economic data that's been coming out fairly positive, and yet the Biden seems to be getting zero credit. In fact, is lagging greatly in the polling data I've seen with respect to his management of the economy. Why is that?
Well, and there are people on this call that would know far more about this than I, but while both the University of Michigan Index of Consumer Sentiment and the Conference Board Consumer Confidence Index, while they both ostensibly measure the same thing, the Conference Board survey is weighted heavily towards employment issues and job availability, that sort of thing, while the University of Michigan's is much more cost of living, much more inflation sensitive. So, they're not, there is a tendency for that to kind of lead things one way or the other. But, it's been the sort of Democratic theory, the case has been the economy is getting better and getting more stable, and inflation is getting under control. And so sooner or later, consumer confidence will improve. And then once consumer confidence improves, then President Biden's approval rating will go up. And that approval rating is the most predictive indicator of whether incumbent president is going to get reelected. Well, the first two elements have happened. Economy has gotten much better. Consumer confidence has improved. Again, you can, which one you move, how much, but we haven't, and the consumer confidence moved up a good bit in December, a whole lot in January, a little bit more in February, but we haven't seen the president's job approval rating, and we haven't seen his matchup, whether nationally or in the key 6 or 7 swing states, haven't seen that happen. And which makes you wonder whether, while inflation, his approval rating had been up in the mid to high 50s for his first 6 months in office, and then it dropped down, dropped about 6 points in June, in June of 2021, and then was at 50 for July, or 50 for July of 2021, 49 for August, and then dropped another 6 points, and has been sort of no higher than 44 in the Gallup poll and no worse than 37, but a bad place ever since. And positive events can happen, negative events can happen, and his numbers are not very elastic. And it makes you wonder whether, even if the spike in inflation back in April, May, June, that started then of 2021, and maybe to a certain extent the rather inauspicious departure from Afghanistan, that other things, other factors may have come in, whether it's other issues like immigration or whatever, crime, whatever, or whether it's concerns about the president's age. But he's shown no elasticity, and you have to kind of wonder about his resiliency at a time like this. But when we look at these numbers on, for example, Wall Street Journal poll, national poll back in late November, early December, did Trump policies help you or hurt you personally? helped me personally, Trump 49, hurt me 37. But for Biden, it was helped me personally 23 and hurt me personally 53. And the New York Times had very similar results when they did their, about the same time when they did their 6 swing states. And I can kind of go through number after number after number, who do you trust more, who did a better job, that sort of thing. And almost across the board, people have a rosier impression of where things were back under Trump than they have for the time since the transition. And again, whether they should or shouldn't is beside the point. But it is what it is. That's what they seem to think very, very clearly, and not by narrow margins.
So we have a question that came in related to this. I was going to move on to something, but actually this is a great question of, given the statistics and you sort of got into this. I mean, the difference between employment numbers, GDP growth versus inflation, and more macro versus what the individual feels on a micro basis. I mean, is that what's going on as to why Biden's not getting any credit if he can point to these broader macro numbers? Is it that they can't, whatever they say is not going to make a difference, or are they not saying it very well?
I'm not sure it's a messaging problem, to be honest. But, as I mentioned a while ago, 90% of the vote is just baked in. People who are Democrats or lean Democrat vote Democratic overwhelmingly. Same thing on the Republican side, leaving a very narrow slice in the middle. And for these people, they don't vote on the economy. They vote on my economy and what is their perception of how their finances are going. And while there are lots of very, very impressive economic statistics about how strong this economy is and stuff, you still have, mortgage and automobile delinquencies at some extremely high levels and going up. It's like the old story about the guy who had one foot in a pot of boiling water and the other foot in a bucket of ice, but on average, he was very comfortable. That we look at these averages, at these macro numbers, but you could have a slice of voters in the middle that are experiencing something very different from what the other 90% are, and that their reaction to having had inflation all but non-existent for 30 years and then come roaring back, and what they see along the border, this and that, they just have some real reservations about President Biden and all the issues that one might think would plague former President Trump don't seem to resonate with that 8 or 10% in the middle. And keep in mind that when you're talking about these pure independents who don't lean either way, these are people who read, watch, listen to news less than the 90% who are partisans. They don't think about politics very much. They don't check in till pretty late. And they tend to be very fickle. They tend to get buyer's remorse. And they tend to punish the in party. That's a very clear pattern. And so it's people need to sort of keep in mind, who is it that really is going to decide the election? And it's going to be, in some ways, you could say, some of the people that are least cognizant of what's going on, of the issues facing the country as a whole, or the state of the overall economy.
I got a couple more questions, but I want to come back to a couple of things. So one, beyond the economy, and maybe the economy is the penultimate or whatever, but you mentioned border. We haven't talked about Israel and Gaza. I mean, are those other potential drags for Biden, or is it just all about the economy?
No, I think that it's about all of those. And there are issues of, say, the abortion issue, for example, that does tend to cut the other way, but it doesn't seem to be as driving an issue for as many people as you would think. But economy, border, crime, and then this Israel-Hamas situation these are big, these are big things. But then just the perception of the president's age and reservations about whether, at 86 at the end of a second term, closer to 90 than 80, people just have a big problem with that, and it's and you know, we're talking about, you know, 4 years older than Reagan was when he left office, and because Vice President Harris has not really connected well with many voters, that's not a reassuring factor either for having an 81-year-old president seeking a another 4-year term.
Do you think, I want to get to respective bases between Biden and Trump, and maybe a couple of ways, a couple of other points before you get there. Do you think, I mean, do you think the die is cast for Biden? Do you think, I mean, you read what is the quote, I think, is something, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative, I believe. Maybe that's a strategy, maybe it's not, but do you think that Biden shares the spotlight more, assuming that it's a Trump Biden, and we'll come to a couple of questions I got on that, but just at this moment, assuming it's a Trump Biden general election, does Biden get any hope that now he's sharing the spotlight more with Trump, and Trump's, you know, if Biden has some negatives, Trump's negatives start to get focus?
Yeah, I would never say that, you know, there's no way Biden can come back, that this thing's all locked up, and just, you know, we both have been around politics for a long time, and you've actually won elections. I haven't, but when there's some feelings that people have that they are somewhat malleable, but there's some that seem to be getting deeply ingrained. And the fact that President Biden's numbers have stayed in this very, very narrow trading range since September of 2021, that it suggests that it's sort of, some of these things have hardened to a large extent, and that for those independent voters in the middle, they may or may not personally like former President Trump. They may not like his behavior, but they associate that 4 years with a better time than the last 3 years. And, you know, I have to say, I still having to kind of get my arms around the idea that, you know, the most disruptive political figure in American political history somehow represents stability to this narrow group in the middle, but that would seem to be the case. But no, I don't think it's done, but there's a lot of just really troubling data. I mean, just take, for example, the 6 swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and then Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. Some people throw in North Carolina as well. But those first 6, and Biden carried all 6. Right now, he's, just to look at the Real Clear Politics averages, Trump is ahead in 5 of them. And 2 of them are more or less tied within a percentage point, Michigan and Pennsylvania. Those are not, I mean, even if Biden won both of those, Trump would still get 278 electoral votes, and which is enough to win. But no, I don't think it's over, but I don't think this thing is nearly as in play as a lot of other people seem to think or would like to think it is. And again, I'm not for or against anybody. My job is just call balls and strikes. But I'd rather have the hand that Donald Trump's carrying, even with all of his legal problems and personality. I'd rather have that than the hand that President Biden's holding.
So we've had a couple of questions. Obviously, this has been in the press as well, and there's still primaries going on, in both the Democratic and Republican primaries that are going on. Is it a fait accompli that it will be Trump versus Biden? Is questions, will Dean Phillips break through, or Nikki Haley break through? I think you know the answer to that, but what is the likelihood that one of those two doesn't become the nominee, that Biden decides not to run, or something happens and Trump doesn't run?
Yeah, I mean, given the circumstances, you know, I could see someone like President Biden deciding not to run, but the fact that hadn't happened now, and it seems to be diminishing in likelihood, you know, every week that goes by. At this point, I think there's just a very small chance. And so at that point, unless he had just sort of some kind of a medical event, it's happening. And most Americans have no really idea who Dean Phillips is, and he could live to 110 and they still won't know who he was. For former President Trump, I think this thing hasn't been competitive in 10 months or so. That there was a little flurry early in 2020, right after the mid-22 midterm election, but after about 4 months after that, and actually after the Manhattan grand jury indicted him on the porn payoff case, his numbers snapped back among Republicans. And when you look at polling that asks Republicans, I mean, that 85% or so of Republicans have a favorable opinion of Trump, half of them very favorable, 60% to 2/3 will at least say they think that he actually won the election. Big majorities think that he's done little or nothing wrong, or it's all exaggerated or politically motivated, or he's a victim of political targeting. And they see him as very electable. So for these other candidates, and many of them are very, Haley, some of the others, very bright, talented people, they're like job applicants where there is no job opening. And that for Republicans just weren't looking for an alternative. Most of them weren't looking for an alternative to Trump. And if anything, this is more of an audition for 2028 than anything else. But again, short of a medical event, but I don't think there's going to be a federal criminal trial this year. And the Georgia case has been somewhat discredited, and the New York state case was the flimsiest of all of them. I don't think there's going to be a legal thing happen between now and the election. So, I think it's just down to, some medical is the only thing that could sort of derail Trump's nomination. And, they should have that. They should have the 1,215 delegates within the next 2 weeks, the majority. So I think it's about as set as things get in American politics.
So, and there's a question of this, and there was some press today. Trump, to your point, seems to be, marching through the primaries like, Sherman through Georgia, but there's still a 30 to 40% share that either is going to Haley or not for Trump. Is that, and some analysts have said that may be troubling. Is that, how much of that is core Republican? How much of that is a proxy vote versus, a real vote? How much of that are independents? Is that something, and I'll come back to Biden's base, but is that something that the Trump people need to look at and say, well, yeah, we're killing it in the primaries, except for 30 to 40% who seem to want somebody else, and does that translate into a problem in the general election?
My guess is we're going to see the Trump people basically ignore Haley, and I think they can. And if I were in their shoes, that's probably what I would do. But I don't think, when it's one thing to say, if you're a Republican, well, I would rather, I don't like him personally, but I liked a lot of his economic policies, and I wish we had somebody that didn't have the legal problems or didn't have the behavioral issues that the president has. But then when you say, okay, are you going to vote for a Democrat, given that? And they'll say, well, a lot of them will start kind of backing off. And that if there was a very large segment of Republicans that just aren't going to vote for Donald Trump, and it's not offset by concerns among Democrats about whether President Biden should be running and whether he should be president for another 4 years after this one, then it's not that, it's probably not that big a deal. But, just looking at the broad numbers, again, whether it's key states or overall, I would rather be holding Donald Trump's hand than President Biden's.
And on the flip side, I mean, there's been a lot written that Biden's base lacks enthusiasm, that his share of African American votes may not be as strong as it was, that the I guess so-called progressive wing is upset with him not following through on their priorities. I've always wondered how big is their bite versus their bark. There's an issue in I guess we'll see in Michigan this week on the uncommitted because of the Arab American community, Palestinian American community that's quite large in the state of Michigan. Is that a problem for Biden? It may be a bigger problem for Biden than Trump has on Republicans who aren't supporting him in the primary.
Yeah, it's always easier to focus on the problems of one candidate and to blow them out of proportion, but you have to kind of step back and, take all of it into account. I would be hard pressed to come up with any demographic group or political subgroup that President Biden is as strong today as he was, say, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And whether you're talking about African Americans, whether you're talking about Latinos, whether you're talking about younger voters, he's softer and or has enthusiasm problems with each of those groups, and that's a problem. And then across the sort of sun belt of those swing states, he doesn't look nearly as strong as he did 4 years ago. The Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and for that matter, North Carolina. When you kind of throw it all in together, he's in a very, very weakened situation, and one where, I tell my Democratic friends, if I were you, I'd be praying morning, noon, and night that the president would change his mind and not seek reelection. And if he didn't, that Democrats don't nominate Vice President Harris. And would tell my Republican friends, if I were you, I'd be praying every morning, noon, and night that Biden doesn't change his mind, or that if he does, that Democrats nominate Harris, because Biden and Harris are probably the only Democrats that Donald Trump could beat. Just as, just as Trump is about the only Republican that maybe Biden or Harris could possibly beat. But in the matchups, one-on-one, again, statewide, in key states and nationally, these internals don't look good for the president. They really don't.
We've had a couple of questions about third-party candidates. I mean, there's obviously the no labels, which there is, I guess, no labels candidate, and then on the flip side, there Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Cornel West. There are some third-party candidates that are out there running. Are they a factor? If there was a no labels candidate, would they be a factor? And if they were a factor, could they win? If they can't win, who do they hurt? Who do they help?
Yeah, I think third-party independent candidates, they can be spoilers, but they can't be victors. And when you take the dozen or whatever states, starting with Massachusetts, that are going to vote Democratic no matter what, another 10, 12 that are going to vote Republican no matter what, it's pretty hard for any other candidate to get 270 electoral votes necessary to win, or it gets thrown to the House where each state gets one vote and there are no independent candidates. But the thing is, I think the president's got real problems in a two-way race. And then to the extent that you add in other candidates, I think it just takes a difficult race for the president and makes it more so. You can make a case that Robert Kennedy Jr. could cut Trump as much or a little bit more than Biden. You can make that case. But for no labels, when you look at how Biden won in 2020, it was by winning independents and moderates by a really big margin. And depending upon obviously who it was, but a no labels candidate would really cut very, very badly. And then, even take a Cornel West, and I don't think he'd get many votes at all. But, in 2016, Jill Stein got very, very few votes, but her vote totals each in Michigan, in Wisconsin, with Pennsylvania were greater than Trump's victory margin in each of those three states. So it doesn't take many votes in these really close states to do it. And the final thing is, I think, again, with some of these swing voters, there's a group of people that are not going, there is a group of people that are not going to vote for Donald Trump. They're just not. But they don't really want to vote for Joe Biden. And if it's just a Trump-Biden race, some of them will hold their noses and vote for Biden. Some of them might not vote. But if you gave them an off-ramp, if you give them any option at all, they will take it with that, a slice of all of that. But, when you ask Trump voters, would you say you're voting for Donald Trump or against Joe Biden? Overwhelmingly, they say they're voting for Donald Trump. When you ask Biden voters, by a pretty substantial margin, they're voting against Trump, not for Biden. But you give them options and they'll take those options. And, but when you have, 60+% of your own party members not thinking that you should not run for reelection, that should be as good a warning sign as any.
A couple of questions of whether or not, and you mentioned the Vice President Harris, of whether or not Biden would consider replacing his vice presidential candidate, and then another question as to who will be Trump's vice presidential nominee.
I think one could question the wisdom of having picked Harris to begin with, but I think the political fallout of replacing Harris would be so great that it wouldn't be worth any potential gain. So I would be absolutely astonished if that were to happen, and that I just think it would cause a backlash with certain groups that would be not really worth it. In terms of former President Trump, it's interesting from an election perspective. I don't think it matters who he picks, because people are either going to be voting for or against Donald Trump or for or against Joe Biden. But I don't think Trump's running mate is going to make any difference in terms of electorally speaking. Now, having said that, given Trump's age and legal issues, from a governing standpoint, who he picks could be very, very important. So governing, really important. Winning the election, almost pretty much inconsequential. But I certainly don't have any inside connections to understand how Trump is going to approach his decision. But Congresswoman Elaine Stefanik is, that's probably as good a guess as any. But you can bet that he will pick someone who he is absolutely 100% convinced will be loyal, and even more loyal than he thought Mike Pence was.
So there's a question I want to come back to, but around AI. But before we do, because we have that much time left, I want to shift to Congress a little bit. One is just what you think is going to happen in the congressional elections, the House, the Senate. We've obviously, again, we had reapportionment. We've had some further reapportionment, and as we do mid decade redistricting because of court cases and legislatures flip and they change the lines. Has that shifted one way or the other? You have a very narrow House. I think the Republicans right now have a 2 or 3 seat because of some vacancies and lost the seat in Long Island, and you had that Long Island race. Does that tell us anything? And then in the Senate, you have even a narrower margin, and Democrats having to defend, I think, twice as many seats as Republicans, including some pretty tough seats in so-called red states. What's your outlook on those elections? How much does the top of the ticket drive the House and Senate elections?
The country is evenly divided, and the House, not so much the Senate, but the House reflects that. And the Democrats came out of the 2020 election with a half dozen seat majority. Republicans came out of 2022 with a half dozen. It's been whittled down, as you said, just to a couple of votes now. But I think Democrats may have eked out an extra 2 or 3 seats on redistricting, but I think it's probably easier just to say the House is going to be a flip a coin thing. There's very little ticket splitting in our elections, but when you're dealing with the 2 most least popular political figures in the country, you could also see some people hedging their bets, voting for one of them for president and thinking, I don't really trust this person to have everything, so maybe throw in a vote in a competitive race the other direction for the House. So I'd just say the House is 50-50, give or take. The Senate, as you know, since been 51-49. Joe Manchin is not running for re-election. Republicans are a lock to pick that up. So effectively, it's 50-50. But Democrats went into this cycle with defending seven Senate seats in states that Trump carried at least once, three that he carried twice, Ohio, Montana, and West Virginia, and then four more that he carried one time. So this is and there are no Republican seats that are really competitive at all. So that this is as bad a map as Democrats have had in about 30 years. Now, given West Virginia certainly going to the Republican side, even if Democrats held on to John Tester in Montana and Sherrod Brown in Ohio and Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Casey, even held on to all the others, if Trump wins, Senate's 50-50, the new vice president breaks the tie. But it'd be hard to see Republicans not pick up at least one out of those six. So I think really there's a lot more question in terms of how big is the Republican majority going to be? Is it going to be 50? Is it 50 with a vice president, or 51 or 2 or 3? Something like that. And that is going to be driven in part by who do Republicans choose in their primaries. That they should have won the Senate back in 2022, but in arguably about 4 U.S. Senate races and some more in the House and governor, Secretary of State, Attorney General, Republicans just picked some really exotic people who were uniquely incapable of winning enough swing voters to win. They kind of jumped the shark in terms of who they nominated. So much as they did back in 2010, 2012. So whether Republican primary voters, if they vote, do they vote using their brains or using their glands? I think that's going to make a huge difference in terms of the size of a Republican majority in the Senate. So House flip a coin, Senate, it's really more a question of how big of a majority Republicans will have. And that while, yes, we have a lot less ticket splitting than ever before, we've never had an election. I mean, even 2016, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, it was less polarizing than this election is right now. So whether the people voting straight tickets will match that election, we'll have to wait and see.
Do you think any of the issues, there's a question about how, I think it was Main Street women, terms often used, Republican suburban women, but it may not be the same thing. But do you think issues like abortion, the Alabama Supreme Court decision this past week, or flip side, the border, do those issues, break through or separate from the presidential race, that where it might create some differentiation in a Senate race or a House race from what's happening at the top of the ticket?
We have seen some high-profile races since the Dobbs decision where that were either exclusively or primarily about abortion. And those votes have gone very much on the pro-choice side, and in a way that Democrats would really, really like. But in the 2022 election, I think there's a gigantic misread of what happened in that election, because this idea that Republicans didn't do as well as they should have in 2022 because of the abortion issue, it flies in the face of the fact that there were 10 million fewer votes for Democrats in the House of Representatives in 2022 than there were in the previous midterm elections in 2018. While there were like 3.5 million more Republican votes in 2022 for the House than for Democrats. That this idea that it mobilized a lot of people to come in and vote for Democrats, it doesn't seem to be the case. And I think what happens is, if the focus is on that issue, it's big, and big lots of places, even places like Kansas and Ohio. But if it's thrown in the mix with the economy, the world situation, crime, border, all these other age, all these other issues, it just gets diluted down and didn't seem to have nearly the impact in 2022 that a lot of people would like to think it did.
And just in terms of like for many of our viewers in the New York area, they just had this recent special election for the Swazi won that race. Was that a breakthrough on issues? I mean, obviously it was about border crime, abortion, or was there more legacy with this predecessor that was an issue as well?
Yeah, I think sometimes special elections can tell you something, and a lot of times they don't. And it's always easier to make that assessment in history books than it is contemporaneously. I wouldn't want to, I think the circumstances were unusual enough that I would not want to extrapolate it. But, regardless which side was going to win, one side was going to say it says everything you need to know about this year's election. The other side was going to say it snowed. That's why we lost. And I'm going to reserve judgment till we get a much bigger sample size than 1/4 and 35th of the country.
So maybe we have a couple of minutes left, and I had a couple of questions about AI, how artificial intelligence might impact this election. How maybe candidates use it in certain ways. Maybe it's used against candidates. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm 70 years old. Asking me about AI, I mean, I wish I had more natural intelligence. But I don't know. That's you would be better off asking someone a half or a third my age. I'll take the fifth on that one.
Well, let me ask you this question, because there's been a lot discussed about the 2016 election, 2020 election, the role of media, social media, disinformation. How much, from your perspective, do you see that as a factor in influencing votes and election outcomes?
Yeah, as I said, that group in the middle, the 8 to 10% pure independents, they read, watch, listen to news less than anybody else. And there is a growing segment of Americans that practice what's called news abstinence, where they have just decided, I am not going to listen. They're like pulling covers over your head. I'm not going to listen to watch, listen, read news anymore. And for some of them, it's just, I don't believe what the media says. But for others, it's like everything is so depressing. Life is tough enough as it is. And so there's just when we have these events happen that historically would have shaped public opinion one way or the other, it's like a dead letter box. It doesn't, these events do not resonate with a key segment of the electorate, which arguably is the key segment of the electorate. And so how they consume, people that cut the cord, that don't watch news, don't read, and they just get little bites of news here or there that may or may not have been curated by any kind of professional. We've got we have a lot of voters that are making decisions on whim or out of, anger or disappointment, whatever, rather than based on, any real information. The world is just a lot different than it was, Ken, when you and I and Barbara grew up, when people would, watch one of the 3 broadcast news, broadcasts in the evening, or, read daily papers. And we're in a different media environment, and it's one that I find very, very, very concerning.
Right. Thank you, Charlie. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our president, Barbara.
Yeah, thank you so much. What a great conversation. And Charlie, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know how busy it is moving up towards Super Tuesday. And as always, Ken, we love having you with us. I just want to mention we have a great calendar ahead. Eric Holder, the 82nd Attorney General of the U.S., will do a webinar for us actually tomorrow. In March, we host Jennifer Doudna, the Nobel laureate in chemistry, among many other things, March the 4th. And David Ricks, the CEO of Eli Lilly, on March the 12th. We have Chris Waller, a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, on the 27th. And looking toward the spring, we are fortunate enough to have Professor Jeremy Siegel at the Wharton School in a conversation with John Williams. And then Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel of the Federal Communications Commission will be joining us April the 4th. Susan Collins, the president and CEO of the Boston Fed, is also going to be coming, as well as the governor of the Bank of France, Francois Villeroy de Gaulle, and of course, Jamie Dimon. That appears to be a very popular event, will be with us April the 23rd. And then we have Jared Bernstein, the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, on April the 30th. So there's a lot here, and frankly, there's a lot being added. So please be sure to review the dates and keep track of our calendar online. As always, I just want to take a quick minute to thank those of our 372 members of the Centennial Society, some of whom have joined us today, for their contributions, which continue to be the financial backbone of support for the club. And thank you all for attending today. We had actually great attendance. It looked like it was approaching 150, which is terrific. We look forward to seeing everybody again soon. And Charlie, thank you. We'll look forward to having you in this fall in person, closer to the election. So thanks so much. And of course, thank you, Ken. Take care.
Thank you.